Your head's a crappy office. We use the phrase mind like water. You need to be clear. It deals with things coming at you can't see. It's very much like email, thought. I have a mission, basically our mission of GTD is to have a world where there are no problems, only progress. I didn't make this stuff up, Brian. I recognized it.
Things are coming. They're going to be good things, they're going to be bad things, but most of us aren't necessarily prepared for the next thing.
How fast can I integrate this new information, accept it, say where I want to go now, and refocus and recalibrate? You implement these best practices, it creates more room. What you do with that room is quite unique to you.
What about people that say they don't have time?
Yeah, well, you find enough time to do something. You take showers and brush your teeth. Find time to do that. Why? You can't stand not doing it. The biggest issue most people have is they're just addicted to their stress. If I can help people feel more in control of their life, more stable, that will minimize their interest in doing those negative things. All you need to do is deal with what's in front of you presently with as much elegance and excellence as you can, and the next thing will show up automatically.
They say that the human race is doomed, that we have lost touch with our true nature, that the media has corrupted us, and that the planet has no future. I disagree. I believe that humanity is full of hope, and that our salvation lies within each one of us. My name is Brian Rose, and my job is to listen, the oldest method of learning known to man. Each week I seek out individuals that are changing the world, people who are living and thinking in a different way. Their stories will challenge your beliefs, make you question your choices, and perhaps inspire you to change. I never planned on doing any of this, but now I can't stop. Join me on this mission and make humanity something we can all be proud of.
It turns out that your mind is for having ideas, not for holding ideas. And that's the whole concept that David Allen has with his Getting Things Done system. It's all about capturing those ideas, getting them down on paper, and putting them into a system to where you can execute on them. And the truth is this isn't just for CEOs and people on LinkedIn. This is for artists, for housewives, for anybody who just wants to move their life forward. And I love David. I use his system personally. And this was incredible because David went really deep on his early childhood, drug use, all sorts of the crazy things he did as a kid that allowed him to think outside the box and create this amazing system. And I know you're going to love this interview. And inside London Real Academy, we also have an amazing system, but it's an accountability system. It's a way that I get you to do the things you don't want to do in order to create a business, create a podcast, learn how to publicly speak, and literally change your life. If you want to transform yourself, this is exactly how.
London Real doesn't stop when the conversation ends. You see, that's when we get started. Because everything begins with a thought, and then comes the action. The London Real Academy is our global transformation platform. Here we bring together thousands of students from over 75 countries. Whether you want to build a profitable business from your passion, or learn to speak to inspire, or broadcast yourself with your very own podcast, or accelerate your life to become a high-performance person, we have the online accountability course and personal mentoring program that will make your dream a reality. Join us, and we'll take your life to the next level, together. Our next accelerator course is starting soon.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is David Allen, the author, consultant, executive coach, and international lecturer. You are recognized as the world's leading authority on personal and organizational productivity and been acknowledged by Forbes as one of the top 5 executive coaches. Your best-selling book, Getting Things Done, has been translated into 30 languages, and Time Magazine has called it the defining self-help business book of its time. David, welcome back to London Real.
Brian, delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation again.
Great to have you back. It's been just under 4 years.
Amazing.
You were the kind of inaugural guest in this new whole setup of ours, and your episode really resonated with people out there and a lot of our students in our academy and just everyone. So thank you for being there in the early days.
Yeah, delighted. It was one of the better interviews of my 30-year plus career of talking about this stuff.
Fantastic. Well, I'd love to go a little deeper today. I want to hear about what it's like, of course, to live in Holland, a little bit more about GTD and, of course, your upcoming event. But I wanted to start off and just ask you a question. What is a kid from Shreveport, Louisiana, living in Europe, being recognized around the world for his intellectual property? How did that happen?
Well, let's see. How long do we have, Brian?
Time,
I don't. I've always been fascinated by things that were cultural, things that were that had to do with forms. That had to do. In retrospect, let me back up a little bit. In retrospect, as I look back through my life, all the different things I got involved in and got interested in, they all had to do with tapping into something that we can't see, but that I intuitively knew affected everything we did and everything we noticed. There's something individual. You could call it whatever you want. Spirit, your soul, the God, the universal energy, whatever you call it, there's something, I had a sense that there was something bigger. My first job was a magician at age 5. Charged 5 cents for a magic show I did on the sidewalk in Palestine, Texas, where I lived my first 6 years. And so, why was I interested in magic? Well, magic is about stuff you can't see, and it makes things happen. So I kind of always been interested in stuff like that. And I thought I also had the ability to, I studied acting. My mom gave me acting classes when I was 11. And because I used to come out and do comedy shticks for the family and so forth. And so she said, well, there may be something that to support there. So we actually had in Shreveport at Centenary College a very sophisticated, actually, community theater. Semi-professional. In the summer, they would bring in pros from New York and San Francisco and other places to do the leads. And it turns out that I got my first role as playing Lewis in The King and I. So I learned to sing Whistle a Happy Tune and did that. And I fell in love with the theater, fell in love with just being in that kind of environment. So that gave me a taste of, and I met people from New York. I met people from sort of outside the South and outside of Shreveport, which was interesting to begin with. I also had a half-sister. She was my dad's daughter, who was quite a bit older than me, who had wound up marrying many considered him the intellectual chronicler of the Beat generation, a man named John Cleland Holmes. And John and Shirley, my sister, were good friends with Kerouac and Ginsberg and all of those people, of that generation, of the Beat scene itself. And they lived in Connecticut. John was a writer. And I actually got a chance to visit them. My dad died when I was 9, and so my mom took me on a trip to visit my sister in Connecticut. I'd never been there before. But then I got to meet, now you would say, the hippest of the hip in terms of artists and writers and intellectuals that would be visiting with them. So I got to spend 2 or 3 weeks in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. And John Cleland Holmes, his great-grandfather was Oliver Wendell Holmes. So I was starting to be introduced to all of that. But then in high school, I turned out to be, I was a good debater, so we won a bunch of championships there. But there'd been an exchange student in our high school who was from Germany with the American Field Service. AFS was an exchange program. And at the time, there were not many Americans that went for a year. Americans would usually go for the summer because there weren't that many families around the world that would be willing to support and take on an American kid. But I went ahead and applied, and it turns out I got it. So that year there were only 300 of us from the States, and we could have gone anywhere through the American Field Service. Whatever family they tried to match up with, where would I go? So I wound up going to Zurich, Switzerland, lived with a Swiss family for a year, learned to speak a little bit of Swiss German, and got a chance to see a whole new side of culture. I went to Real Gymnasium Zurich, where, a block from the Kunsthaus in Zurich, and I would go down and I'd have a beer in the Odeon Cafe, which is where Dadaism started, and is where Jung, wrote, and then go to the Kunsthaus and see Monet's Water Lily. So, I guess fairly young, sort of surprisingly, I was able to kind of step out of the cocoon then of what one would think of, in a sort of conservative Southern culture.
Right.
And then I decided to go to a crazy little college. I didn't know what I wanted to do kind of when I grew up, but I came back from Switzerland with an interest in, I had thought maybe I would want to go into law, because again, that's sort of this sort of etheric sort of thing. And I came back actually after being in Switzerland with a very big interest in sort of cultural stuff. So philosophy and art and so forth was something that turned me on. My brother had gone, he was 4 years older than me, had gone to a New England, upper university, and flunked out because he went into math and science, but he was really a jazz musician, and I didn't want to go to a big university, maybe have the experience he did. So it turns out I got recruited to go to a crazy little college that was set up in Florida, in Sarasota, Florida, and I was in the second graduating class of this little college, and this little college was called New College, as in New College, Oxford, but New College of Sarasota, Florida, and it was actually a lot of really interested cultural supporters and education supporters with a good bit of money funded this college set up. No grades, design your own education. Sort of take yourself by your own bootstraps, and then use a great faculty, small student body. The dormitories we lived in, no rules, but it was the only building in Florida designed by I.M. Pei. And it was in the old Ringling Museum area. So I got a BA in 3 years. Did a lot of independent study projects. Hitchhiked across the Middle East is one of them in 1967. So by that time, I'd started to taste an awful lot of different kinds of things and different people from a lot of different cultures and different stuff. So I had a fairly wide range of stuff, and I got fascinated. I started out. I hope this is not getting too long for you.
This is great.
I started out interested in philosophy because I thought philosophers, and I tried to read Aristotle and Plato and then a lot of the newer philosophers. And I got a little bored because it seemed like the philosophers proved their original hypothesis with their original hypothesis. I thought, that's kind of a circle, But what got fascinating, I had a great academic advisor who was also the history professor there. And he turned me on to history of thought, history of culture, history of thinking. I got very interested in why those philosophers started with that hypothesis. Why did Kant start with that? Why did Plato start with that? What was different about that? And then I got turned on, fascinating book to read, which really impacted me a lot, was Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, which was sort of an early, in the 20th century, early writing about, he was the first guy that sort of compared the Western civilization to the fall of Rome. That civilizations had their own life, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And he identified the multiple cultures around the world that had gone through these different lifestyles. Why did the Greeks not have a zero? Why did the idea of infinity only showed up in the Western civilization itself? So there were a lot of very interesting things about all that then affected, and also the college I went to focused people on a lot of sort of the cultural history. Why did the Baroque era, did the math, the science, the art, the architecture, the philosophy, the literature, all had similar themes inside of them? So I got fascinated by that. We didn't even use the word back then, paradigms, but really what I began to study or get fascinated by was cultural paradigms. The belief systems we have that we don't know we have, that then are affecting everything we do, everything we express, everything we notice. So again, that was one of those, started to tweak this whole sense of that there's stuff we can't necessarily see, but that if you could get a hold of that, again, I'm probably the laziest guy you ever met. Certainly one of them.
I find that hard to believe.
Well, come on. If I could go boom and move that thing from there to there without having to physically do it, how efficient would that be? Right. So the whole idea of being a magician, or like trying to find out how could I get in touch with whatever those things are, because if it is affecting all of us that much, if we could somehow get inside of that and understand the principles, say, well, that would be really cool. Right. Then we might be able to do stuff or understand stuff or perceive stuff or have a more effective, fun experience in life. Anyway, those were, I don't know that I had those thoughts in that way back then, but in retrospective, I look back on the track. So I wound up in intellectual history. And I got fascinated by the American culture. I did my bachelor's thesis on the decade of disenchantment, America in the 1920s. Which was funny because I did that in 1967 and 68. And of course, what was going on in 67 and 68.
A lot of turmoil, a lot of mayhem.
And all the hippies and everybody else and everybody going, America sucks, and they were leaving the country and going to Paris and smoking dope and doing all kinds of things. Guess what? That was so American. That they were doing that in the 20s. It just wasn't quite the volume that they were doing in the 60s, but that's exactly what they did. That's exactly, and I was saying, these people think they're so unique. I said, it's not unique at all. As a matter of fact, it's quite American. So I got fascinated by all that. So I wound up in American intellectual history in graduate school. I got into Berkeley in 1968.
Wow. And so you went to Berkeley for grad school? Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
So you're already kind of looking into the matrix at this point. You're trying to see things that aren't there. The seeds of the GTD is probably being formed as far as you saying, well, what's happening around us?
Yeah.
Why are we doing these things? Why are we ruled by these invisible laws that we don't understand? Why we're behaving these ways?
Yeah, I got fascinated by that. And then, I was studying people who seemed to be enlightened, and then I decided I wanted my own. And then I also sort of seemed to had the experience that I didn't think I was going to find that in academia, because that was what else could you do but be a history professor? I mean, studying intellectual history or a writer or something. And so I said, okay. And through lots of different things, went on. And of course, Berkeley in '68 was kind of heady time to be there, all that stuff going on. But I really wasn't part of all of that. I was kind of observing it. But at some point, I just said, no, academia is not for me. And one day I just didn't go back to class. And said, okay, I'm going to go after my own enlightenment. And so then I got very interested, fascinated. A friend of mine offered to teach me karate. And so I got involved in the martial arts. I'd always been interested I'd loved the Zen aesthetic. I'd read all of Alan Watts and Suzuki even when I was in high school. And I loved that sort of minimalist elegance that the Zen aesthetic had. And I'd always been very interested in that. So when he offered to teach me the karate, I thought I wasn't really interested for the fighting aspect. I was interested more in what's the idea of a Zen kind of martial art.
Right.
Okay, what would that be like? And so I got involved with that and kind of got hooked into it and wound up getting a black belt back in my 20s.
Was Bruce Lee on the screen then?
Yeah.
Okay, so right early 70s, Enter the Dragon, 72.
Yeah, he had just come on the screen there. As a matter of fact, my sensei had sort of combined various different styles and wound up what he taught me was very similar to what Bruce Lee had come up with, Jeet Kune Do, which was the idea of pure efficiency.
Multiple disciplines.
Pure efficiency.
Interesting.
Because that was what Bruce did. He said, how efficient can I make this body move? Yeah. How much power can I generate with how little effort? Which was and I guess that was kind of an attraction to me. I could probably even tie that into GTD. Like, with how little effort can you have nothing on your mind and make sure things happen out here?
Interesting.
Right.
With Steve Jobs has a famous Stanford graduation speech where he says, when you look back at your life, you can connect the dots in reverse. And he talks about, points in his life where he was fascinated with typefaces. And that later became, the proportional spacing that was on Macintoshes.
Sure.
And I'm listening to your life, and it's these little elements
Sure.
that kind of built parts of GTD.
Yeah, and because I'll even say that now as part of GTD, we use the phrase "mind like water." Like have a clear head. And now the mindfulness people, that's a whole lot of what they're doing now. But I learned that 35 years ago because in the martial arts there was a lot of training about how you clear your head.
Right.
Because if you're walking into being surprised by 4 people in a dark alley, you don't want 2,000 unprocessed emails banging around in your brain, right? You need to be clear. You need to be clear. So how fast can you get clear? So focusing on your breathing was the best way to get clear because it brings you present. Your breathing is current, is present. So that's what, and the mindfulness people know that. You know, that's what if you focus on your breathing, you're not in the future, you're not in the past. You're actually in the present, which is, you know, from my experience, at least with a small s, a key spiritual principle, like acceptance.
Yeah.
But acceptance has to be right now. You know, can you not resist whatever is current, your current realities?
What else did martial arts teach you?
Yeah.
Or was that the big thing, or did it teach you other things?
It was that, and it was, you know, certainly a lot about focus. You know, if you're gonna try to break through 3 inches of wood with your hand, you know, it doesn't take calluses, it takes focus. You know, and what you can't have is the thought of, wow, that's going to hurt in your mind. You know, you have to already see your hand through it. So I learned back then the power of sort of visualization to begin with, because there was so much of that ability to focus, and a whole lot of that's driven by your mind. And so I learned a lot of that. And again, in retrospect, I could say, you know, that a lot of that was just great training, you know, about how to do that.
In one of your TED Talks, you said that, you know, a lot of GTD was a bit like martial arts, as in you're doing these things that are uncomfortable at first, that are building up a pattern that's going to make you work efficiently.
Yeah. And people often ask Brian why I call it a martial art, and the reason is because, I mean, it's really kind of an art, the art of how do I manage the flow of life's work and my commitments and that whole inventory. And you don't end that. I mean, how good can you get at parenting? How good can you get at cooking spaghetti? How good can you get at playing the flute? There's no end to any of those. There's no end to this either. I'm still tweaking and refining. As my life changes, then how do I manage the flow of that change in my life? That never stops. But the reason I call it a martial art is because martial deals with surprise. It deals with things coming at you can't see. Now that's in subtle ways true with painting and dance and anything else. That's like you're dealing with, you know, all kinds of other aesthetic forces, I guess. But it's very much like email, thought that I wake up, oh my God, they just fired me. I just got hired. I just bought a house. I just sold a house. I got divorced. I just got married. I just had a kid. I just discovered I have a life-threatening illness. So when those transition times in life are where you come up against how well can I deal with that? How fast can I integrate this new information, accept it, say where I want to go now, and refocus and recalibrate? That's why it's a martial art.
So GTD is a martial art.
It is.
And you say before that things are coming. They're going to be good things, they're going to be bad things, but most of us aren't necessarily prepared for the next thing because we're running these endless loops in our head.
Well, you're not prepared to deal with them as effectively as you could if you had a clear head. You're going to tend to over and underreact.
Right.
So, see, if we're sparring, you know, Brian, if we're sparring, I'd love nothing more than to get you upset. Because if I can get you upset, you'll over or underreact. It's called a fake, right? And then I win. Because if I can get you to over or underreact, I can control you. So the idea of being really, really clear, you know, so that I don't want to be controlled by something. Now, I'm not saying control like control your kids or the weather or your boss. I mean, good luck. I'm talking about having something under control, right. Like stable and present, so that you're not worried about the meeting you were just in. You're not worried about the meeting that's coming up.
And that's what successful people do. They have it to where they can not under or overreact, and that's how they have quote unquote success in their lives.
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by success.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's success. What does that mean? You know, does it mean happy? Does it mean just achieving desired results? You know, if you go on a vacation to relax and you don't relax, that's an unsuccessful vacation.
Right.
Right. So if you're talking about, I think the people who are usually the most effective, certainly the ones nicest to be around, the ones that are not over or underreacting, and they're just present. You talk to them and they're there.
Yeah, it's big and popular now, the meditation, the presence. But this is something that you've been thinking about for, you know, 10, 20, 30 years.
This is thousands of years. You know, read any of the old texts, you know, about just being present. They all talk about that.
Yeah, and if you look at, some fighters, I watch the UFC a lot, mixed martial arts, and a lot of times the fighter will try to get in the other fighter's head, and again, get them to overreact or underreact, and you can see it plays out right in the ring or in the cage, and it's a bad night for them. And so that's why people should think of their lives that way, as in if they can be in that present state, the non-emotional, non-reactive state, then they can handle what's coming at them in the way that they want to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that there's a lot of what I uncovered as I was getting into all of this. And I probably should complete that story just to bring you up to date, because after I dropped out, got martial arts, then I got involved in both my spiritual explorations, meditation, spiritual practices, people, that were involved in sort of understanding multiple levels of the universe and seemed to have quite a knowledge of how to do that. And then I had my own personal experiences that validated a whole lot of what I had so kind of intuited all along, which is, hey, there's a bigger game out there than we can see. And it's in all of us. We're all engaged in it, but you don't have to wait to die to find out what it is.
What was that experience? Was this?
Oh, I had many of them, but they were an awful lot about sort of letting myself kind of go out of the body and be and see things in another way from a whole different perspective, it was not drug related. It was really just more the ability to be able to do that. And a lot of it kind of happened, not that I was that conscious of it. I had a great spiritual coach, really, a guy named John Roger, that I worked with. I explored a lot of different people and a lot of what they were doing, tried a whole lot of different things, ran across John Roger, and this guy seemed to have gone down the path that I was on, but a lot further than I had gone. But he was the kind of guy that's, you meet people like that. The way he talks, he doesn't really care if anybody believes him or not. He just knows the truth of what he was doing. And I sort of very much resonated with him. I said, I want to hang out with this guy and see what he learns until I sort of run through all that, and then I'll go find something else. And I never ran through all that after 45 years. Wow. He died about 5 years ago. Wow. So that was the basis of my spiritual work and practices. And essentially, as I got involved in that, my inner life got richer, my outer life kind of slowed down. I experimented with a lot of different drugs. They put me away in a mental institution for a short period of time because I demonstrated aberrated behavior.
We almost lost you to that. So just real quickly to interject, last year I ran my first Ironman race, and I had to go to New York City to train for it. And in the process of making the movie, I started talking about my heroin overdose from 2001 when I was in New York City. And I had that in the notes for our last interview, but I hadn't actually ever told anyone about it, including my wife, until last year. And so, and it's been interesting for people to say, wow, I never thought that would happen to you, Brian, because you seem to be the guy that doesn't happen to. And it was interesting for me to talk about because it can happen to anybody, just kind of the drugs and the addiction and stuff. And we almost lost you there briefly, right?
Well, actually, not really. Okay. But I wasn't doing any of those things as escape. I was doing them for exploration. I was fascinated by acid, LSD. I was fascinated by mescaline. I was fascinated by even grass, and by just the consciousness, because I was very much into what's the other consciousness that you can get into and tap into. So it was those days. We're talking the '60s, so that was that was just kind of like. Well, so who wasn't doing anything like that? So mine, and I snorted smack for about a year and a half. And when I decided to stop, I just stopped. Didn't have to go through withdrawal, and had a kind of a bad cold, and that was it. Okay. So I wasn't really, and it's tricky because, as you know, we're quite seductive.
Yeah,
quite seductive.
Funny
because no matter how bad you feel, it makes you feel good, right? And that's why this opioid thing is so I don't know if it's scary, but it's certainly it's quite understandable why a whole lot of people get wound up involved in all that.
Yeah.
But so all those things actually added to a lot of different experiences that I had, and so I wouldn't give any of them up because I wound up getting where I am now through all those things, rungs of the ladder in a way.
And the psychedelics were a big part of it as well.
Well, they just kind of fried my nervous system, so I wasn't able to monitor things quite so well, and so I went through a period where I was hearing voices, I was seeing things, that were showing up, and from my experience and other things, they were not necessarily unreal, and I started to get kind of mad at the world because I could see, I was in a way so psychically, tuned. I could tell what was going on in people's heads just being around them and feel what they were feeling, and that was not that fun. To be able to do that. But I also saw people, that were doing really weird things and whatever, and I started to call people on it, and they got mad and angry, and I got angry at them for not believing me, and so I just kind of got pissed off at the world and pushed up against it. And at some point, people saw I was doing kind of strange things, so they wound up putting me away.
Wow.
So, but I never, actually, and even then, and by the way, I escaped. I said, I don't need to be here. And so I actually jumped over the wall and hitchhiked back to Berkeley. Then they went and caught me again and put me back in maximum security. That was not fun. So then I decided, instead of railing against the world, I think I will cooperate with it. So I tell people now, I'm not any less crazy. You're just looking at a high state of cooperation.
And so how did this turn in to, I guess it was one of your first corporate gigs, which turned into GTD. I mean, what are those next 9 years like?
Well,
10 years like?
Yeah, this was 71. That's when I got sort of involved in the spiritual work, and I was more interested in the spiritual work and the inner work. I was certainly clean by that time and not doing. I wasn't smoking. I had my last drug I took in December 1971. So I haven't done anything except good wine since then. In terms of any of that. So I was cleaned up, had a job, was more interested in sort of exploring now what I had tasted and how to find that. And I had some very good reference points, that had to kind of go back. It's kind of like the drugs let you come up here. My coach described it this way. He said, drugs let you get close to what it is out there, but there's a glass wall between you and it. And he said, in order to get to that, he said, you were able to see some of that, but to get to that, you got to come all the way back around, and come around it from this side. You can't get through that.
Right.
So I stopped everything. I said, okay, because I'd actually tasted, how powerful that was. And, I wanted that. So I wasn't that interested then in the material world. And I'm not a rice bowl and cave kind of guy, and, I was more like into, good wine and pretty girls and, all that good stuff. So I said, well, not sure what I want to do, but I had to pay the rent. So they weren't paying people to do this inner work, right? So that's when I wound up being a good number two guy. So I helped a lot of people start their own businesses, and that's how I started to get into that world. Also got involved in 1978 with the start of Insight Seminars, which was one of the sort of intensive 5-day personal growth seminar experiences, experiential training work, came out of the genre of EST and actualizations of LifeSpring and that genre in the 70s, which was big in the, back then, a lot of that was huge. And I actually became a trainer. I got fascinated by it, and it was quite powerful for me to experience. And I said, that's the kind of work I want to do, that work that is transformational for people, that truly allows them to sort of experience a lot more of who they really are and step free of a lot of the bonds that people have put themselves in. And I actually saw that experience, and I got trained as a trainer. It was all avocational. I wasn't getting paid for that. But then in that personal growth work, the corporate world actually was starting to get interested in that. And especially people in human resources and organization development and so forth that were more of the humanistic type in the corporate worlds, they were taking EST and actualizations and LifeSpring and Insight, which was the company I was working with, and say, God, this is what we need in our company. We don't need another strategic plan. We need people to be honest and nice and talk to each other and be real, and and all those golden goodies that were the result of personal growth, the good personal growth kind of trainings that were there. So I was very involved in all of that. Had a lot of experiences with agreements. As I mentioned, that was a huge part of not a huge, but it was a significant part of that training, was understanding the power of agreements that you make with yourself or with other people. And when you break an agreement, what happens? There's an automatic price. Trust disintegrates. Your trust of yourself and the trust of anybody else that you happen to have made agreement with. And that's a price you pay automatically. So there was a lot of sort of introduction of the idea of agreements, which, by the way, a whole lot of what GTD is about is getting you clear about what are your agreements with yourself.
Okay.
Right? What are all your could, should, would, need tos, ought tos? And I discovered, as opposed to just being a minor part of it, that was a huge amount of as we were being kind of brought into the sort of corporate training world with some of this stuff. And that kind of took on the flavor of personal efficiency, personal effectiveness. And so we were doing, me and a partner of mine then, Russell Bishop, who's still a good friend, and we were doing a good bit of this work together. We started a sort of consulting wing of this personal growth training company and did quite a bit of very interesting work in some of the big corporations. But the time management piece, that was starting to be sort of a big thing. This was the early 80s when that was starting to be kind of a thing out there. There were personal planners and time management trainings, and those kind of things were showing up. And at the same time, I got a lot of vectors here. At the same time, I started my own consulting practice. After helping all these people manage their own businesses, I'd just show up and get a job with my friends who were starting a restaurant in LA, and I was chief cook and bottle washer. A friend of mine had a landscape company, so I helped manage his landscape company. I sold mopeds. I had a vitamin distributorship. I managed a service station, and we did car restorations. I mean, that's where
glass blowing too.
Glass blowing, absolutely. Yeah.
And these agreements, like, would you go in? What are some of these agreements that we make with ourselves and with other people?
I need cat food. I need a life. Anytime you tell yourself, I want good, would, should have something different than it currently is, and you've now got a relationship to that. You're now engaged with it. Whether you admit it or not, you will eat that. Eat it meaning you put the karma in motion. You say, I need to, would, could, should. So they're all agreements. Hey, Brian, I'll get back to you about that. I just made an agreement. You say, hey, David, here's a restaurant you ought to try in London. I go, oh God. Now, if I just said, I really don't want to forget that, I just made an agreement with myself that I would like to, would, could, should, need to keep track of that, right? So little, big, personal, professional, doesn't matter. And most people have no clue how many agreements they've made with themselves. And other people. And that's a lot of what the initial part of the GTD process really is just getting you to identify what's got your attention.
Right. Fleshing out all the agreements that are swimming around in my head
exactly
for the past years, days, years.
Anytime.
And every day we're conscious, more agreements are happening in our mind, whether we want to or not.
Yeah.
Because that's what the brain does.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it does.
And
it's hungry. It's hungry. The mind looks at things and it wants. It says, so it's hungry for that. So you can learn to manage all of that, but as I would just go in and help these people do their business. But as I was starting that consult, I said, well, first of all, helping people improve their process, and then I get bored. Once we improved it, then I get bored and go find another job. Well, then I discovered they actually pay people to do that. They call them something, right? Consultant.
Right.
Wow, couldn't spell it, now I are one. 1981, hang on, my shingle, Allen Associates. And then I got very hungry to say, okay, wow, if this is going to be my career, it'd be nice to find some good models that if you asked me to show up and I thought I could help you and it wasn't clear how I could help you, it'd be nice to pull something out of my back pocket that would be a model that I could apply, no matter who you are, where you are, what your business was, that would improve your condition and maybe have you willing to pay me money for it, right? So that's where I got very hungry for models. Also, I was hungry for clear space. My life was getting a little bit more complex, and having discovered both in my meditation, spiritual practices, as well as the martial arts, how cool it was to have a clear head, how much more effective I could be and happier it could be and more relaxed. But it was starting to get screwed up with this complexity of my world was increasing. Right. And so I got hungry for techniques for myself that would keep my head clear.
Scratching your own itch, as they say.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I had a guy who met me. He kind of took to me. He'd been for 25 years, had been an executive consultant in organizational change, had done a lot of work and had uncovered quite a number of techniques that he found were extremely useful and practical if he was trying to get, senior people in an organization to actually be able to move forward toward where they wanted to go, as opposed to kind of being in mud and quicksand. And so Dean took to me and he said, David, I brought him a client. He said, well, since you brought me this client, I'll take you under my wing and share with you everything I know. You help me, you and I can just deliver this work together. So we did. And he taught me a ton of stuff. And the first thing he did was he sat down and said, David, let me share something with you that how we're going to work, first of all, with the guy at the top and then each one of their directs. He said, I'm going to put you through that process. The first thing was pen and paper, big stack of printer paper, nice pen. Okay, David, empty your head. One thought per piece of paper. Boom, boom, boom. Okay. Oh my God. Now I wasn't broken. I mean, I had my act pretty well together. I had no idea though what would happen once I unloaded all of that. And then he had me take that pile of paper, put it back in front of me, one at a time. What is it, David? What's the next action? And if I could finish the action in 2 minutes, we did it right then. If I could delegate it, we'd actually delegate it on a handwritten memo that would go into my out basket, out to delegate. Or I would put a Post-it with the next action on the piece of paper and put that in a big pile. Right. And then with that big pile, first of all, I'd finished a lot of 2-minute things. I'd delegated quite a number of things. And then I had a big pile of still stuff I had to do. It was longer than 2-minute actions. He said, David, just organize that pile of next actions however you want. And so I went, well, let's see, that kind of goes here, that kind of goes there. Then we grab manila folders. And he said, okay, just organize those in some 7 to 10 categories you've got. Right? And then stick those in your second basket. And then before you start your day, you just thumb through all those things, find the things that you really think you can get to, need to get to first, pull those pieces of paper out, stick them in a red folder on the front of your desk. Changed my life. I went, oh my God, how cool is that? So those became really key elements. And he had uncovered that because he discovered that executives who hadn't done that had all this old business clogging up their head, and they're trying to create new stuff, and their old business is just eating them like rats, and they're in the cellar. And so he had discovered that that was absolutely critical for an executive. Top person first, and then you had to go fast and then work with all their directs because they're spewing out all this work that they were the bottleneck.
Isn't that strange that something that sounds so simple, you just described it in 3 minutes, could change someone's consciousness?
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. It did mine, and suddenly it, without fail, produced clarity, focus, more mental space, more of a sense of control, more of a sense of stability, more ability to focus on the meaningful stuff. And I turned around and started to do that with all of my other clients. It turned out it produced exactly the same results, no exception. More control, more stability, more focus, more space to focus on meaningful things. I went, wow, that's cool. So I discovered, that was the beginning of what was to become GTD 25 years later when I wrote the book. It wasn't GTD then. GTD was just the shorthand for getting things done, which was the title of the book. Right.
But it became the system.
Became the system.
And it works because, also the same time in the 80s is kind of when computers are happening. And then probably without thinking, we're subconsciously comparing our brains to computers. But the brain is nothing like a computer. It's this weird piece of biology that does some things well and doesn't do other things well. Mm-hmm. And that's why your system works.
Well, now, and if you've read the new edition of Getting Things Done that I did a couple of years ago, I put a final chapter in there on the cognitive science research that's shown up since I wrote the first edition that's basically validated the fact that your head's a crappy office. Your brain did not evolve to remember, remind, prioritize, or manage relationships with more than 4 things. It does what it does brilliantly, which is use pattern recognition and long-term memory so that you're talking to a person instead of vibrations of light and sound. So you're doing that right, me too. That's a light, that's a flag, that's a camera, that's whatever, as opposed to vibrations of light and sound. We make sense out of these things brilliantly in the present, right? Because that's how we survived on the desert and the savannah and the jungles and whatever, in the present. That's a bear, there's a snake over there, oh, there's berries to eat.
Right.
Yeah, we do that extremely well.
And this is purely an instrument of survival, isn't it, by definition?
And it does that extremely, and computers can't even come close to that yet.
Right.
They're starting to. They're trying to, but they can't even come close to knowing who you are and what you're thinking or whatever. And there's all kinds of stuff we do really well, but what we don't do well is remember, remind. Your brain is brilliant at all that stuff, but you go to the store for lemons and come back with 6 things and no lemons. What happened? You tried to use your head as your office. And most people probably watching or listening to this are still using their head as their office to try to remember, remind, prioritize, and manage relationships with the multiple things in the complexities of our lives. And how do I manage, might want to get a divorce with, I need cat food, with, we need to sell the house, with, I need to hire a vice president of marketing. And by the way, I just found out I got a major tooth infection. That's only 6. Add that, multiply that by about 20, and you'll have the typical person's life now. And it's all trying to be managed in here. Whereas if you literally wrote all that down on a whiteboard or somewhere, you'll have a whole different perspective.